The idea of seeing China represented in a grand strategy game with the granularity of Crusader Kings has fascinated me since, well, frankly, since the moment I learned what a grand strategy game even is when I first played Crusader Kings 2. At the time, no historical Chinese empire was in the game, not even as an off-map presence. From there, I went to Europa Universalis 4, and while I came to really like the game, my first reaction was dismay that it wouldn't let me play as a vassal within the Ming Empire, and that one played as a country. I hadn't fully grasped that the difference between franchises was more than just the time frame. Eventually, Crusader Kings added an off-map presence, and later, very recently actually, with All Under Heaven, put China on the map. The reason China in a GSG fascinates me is that it's daunting to imagine balancing around. Many mechanics need to be, as I've discussed in other videos, reconsidered once something as massive as a given Imperial China is in play. Take for example the way arable land works and once worked in Victoria 3 and how it intersected peasant population counts and resource consumption and all that. Think about EU4 needing to in some way hamstring Ming lest they snowball. China's scale and geopolitical position necessitate it get bespoke mechanics, and we're going to focus on one of those here. Initially, I intended this video to be a more totalizing look at China in grand strategy games, but frankly, that's a large subject, and I'd rather break it down to both something I know more about and something I can meaningfully zero in on. To that end, I want to center the concept of the Middle Kingdom across history and Europa Universalis using the common thread of the tribute system. In order to do that, we'll have to get into some foundations first, and then work our way to a book on the subject. East Asia Before the West, 5 Centuries of Trade and Tribute is a book by David C. Kang, a professor of international relations at USC. It is by no means a completely dominant work on the subject, but it takes a novel approach while being relatively comprehensive and approachable. We'll be looking at its arguments alongside its critiques and, ultimately, to its potential applications in depicting grand strategy games. This video took a little longer to make than anticipated, as I had to wait for a new copy of the book to arrive. Speaking of books, in the meantime, I was sent a copy of The Book from a company called Hungry Minds who sponsored this video. The book is a sort of meta text, one part grand illustrations, one part facts about the world, history, science, you name it. It covers ground ranging from explaining concrete things like, well, concrete, onto abstract practices like crop rotation. It's made for the aspiring jack of all trades who likes to just know stuff. They had a tremendously successful crowdfunding effort and did not let the resources go to waste. It's got around 400 pages of info and illustration and a dedicated team behind them all. I think it would make a great gift for anyone you know who is both a curious person and inclined towards what I can only call big books. The book would click for the sort of person who loves things like exhibition books, illustrated manuscripts, and really just anyone who loves learning new little facts all the time. If you're watching this channel, I imagine you at least know someone like that. One of my favorite things about it is, no joke, the feel of the pages. They're a nice earthy matte paper, which brings a certain warmth to the illustrations as well. If you'll pardon a weird analogy, these pages are to glossy coffee table book pages what a warm lamp is to an overhead fluorescent light. It's just pleasant. My favorite illustration is probably the little jester man on the printing press page. Check the link below if you want to see if the book would appeal to someone you need a gift for, or to see all the other things they offer. Now back to the tribute system. Seeing as Europa Universalis 5 is relatively new, I thought it would be good to offer a basic primer on the tribute system to get everyone grounded. EU5's depiction will later be contrasted with 4's, but there's enough in EU5's tribute system at launch that it deserves most of the focus. Now, one hiccup here is that the game is in its volatile patching era, and so some things I've observed in play might not be true now, might have changed mid-video production, or might be different by the time this video is up, and beyond it. A lot of this comes down to tweaking values. So, the tribute system. EU5 takes the perspective of it being a reciprocal system, which is why it loses a given Middle Kingdom money. That could, at first blush, feel counterintuitive to the name and what we normally consider tribute to be. The tribute system changed over time, and under, for example, the yuan, is sometimes argued to have been extractive rather than reciprocal. It was closer to how we think of normal tributaries. That can be modeled in-game simply by adjusting the slider. You, as the Middle Kingdom, lose authority, but you no longer pay into the system. And when you zero out the tributary slider, you are extracting money from tributaries, since they still have a tributary diplomatic relation as seen on the income side as diplomatic income. This then models the yuan extractive tribute, which harmed their legitimacy without explicitly being called something like yuan tribute mode. There's a minor complication here in how tributaries aren't always tributaries, but I can't tell if that's working as intended. We'll come back to that. The amount you pay a tributary scales in some kind of way with the size of their economy, and it can be a frankly daunting amount. But it serves to be an indirect method for weakening a unified China. I'm personally unsure how these numbers are directly derived, and I do think they could do with some tweaking, much like many of the scaling costs in this game. But to be clear, even with a relatively auto-managed China, you're going to be making more money than like half the world combined. In this ledger screenshot from the 1540s, I'm paying Dai Viet half of England's total income, and around half of Korea's income is coming from me. That's how big my economy is. The tribute system of EU5 is part of the Middle Kingdom International Organization. To represent the trade aspects of the tribute system, countries that join the Middle Kingdom org are given exclusive trade rights with China. Now, why care about tribute and authority? Because it's a sort of added legitimacy mechanic for Middle Kingdom leaders. The main source for it is the slider value. The secondary one is the power of friendly tributaries and some kind of calculation I don't fully understand. But as you can see, it's not simply giving, say, plus 0.01 authority per tributary. The Middle Kingdom leadership has some absurdly powerful laws attached to it, and that's the main player hook for interacting with it besides an alternative gameplay model. But now that I've used the term so many times, maybe we should dig into what the Middle Kingdom is, and attached to that, the oddly obvious yet complex question of what China is. It probably sounds very silly out of context to say, China has appeared in many historical strategy games. It is, of course, a historical reality, and a large, enduring, and impactful one on the history of the world. My point in saying the obvious sentence is to emphasize that it has been depicted in numerous ways across numerous timeframes by various systems with varied lenses. Oftentimes, it is simply known as China. This topic sprawls out a bit, and some of that sprawl is foundational to the topic of the tribute system. First, I'd like to offer a small caveat that I'll be using the word China to describe multiple states that inhabited the same place across time. More pertinently, they have also sought the same role and borrowed historical legitimacy. Dynasties themselves rely on the legacy, legitimacy, and narrative of the previous dynasties, so the idea of a continuity of China is in fact historically grounded. We need to understand that calling it China is not wrong so much as non-specific. The Ming did not look at the Tang as a wholly different people who happened to be in the same land, after all. China in Paradox games has, across developments, had varying degrees of historicity placed on it. For example, in Victoria 2, China is divided strictly for gameplay reasons. This is not an accurate depiction of Qing governance. As a general rule, earlier games in the Paradox portfolio tend to favor gameplay and balance over historicity. I don't think this is strictly bad, but it's also noteworthy that the malleable nature of history in these games is not evenly applied to the whole world at once. The West has, intrinsically, a higher bar for accurate and nuanced representation. That does not stop here, not even with the new release of EU5. Perhaps I'll be wrong about this come a year of patches, but I suspect that as period-accurate clothing rolls out, Europe will be the first to get it, and get it with more cultural nuance. It's important to note that there is a focus of the game and that it is not China. In a game not centering China but including it, in a game about numbers and resources, China has advantages that could obliterate the game's balance. It must be taken into account when designing, and in turn will end up fleshed out according to a given historical lens. Returning to my obvious question, let's try and answer what China is. A good place to begin is with the name. But the name of China is a complicated enough topic to have its own wiki page, for starters. We won't be getting into all that. For our purposes, the important thing to note is that the term Zhongguo has persisted in recorded use since at least 1000 BCE. Zhongguo means the Middle Kingdom or Central State. It's more a concept than a name for a nation based on something like an ethnicity. Drawing parallels is about as illustrative as it is misleading, but in some sense, Zhongguo, as distinct from, say, Da Ming, would be the difference between understanding Austria and the Holy Roman Empire. Calling the Ming China is anachronistic in the way calling the HRE Germany is. And so it needs to be clarified that the Middle Kingdom, the Emperorship of China, was not a national concept. Of course, Chinese cultures recognized the conquest dynasties as outsiders, but such dynasties wouldn't have lasted a significant span of time if they were considered wholly illegitimate by nature of their outsider status. So, if the concept of the Middle Kingdom is not an ethnically or nationally organized one, and emperorship could come from outside China, you can see why distinguishing the terms of China and the Middle Kingdom has value in a historical setting, despite the contemporary name and its origin. But that leads us to the other word that has a historical meaning we need to bear in mind when getting a fuller picture of the Middle Kingdom: the emperor. What is an emperor? In Crusader Kings terms, an emperor is just someone who is above a king. It's some kind of peak of hierarchy, much the same in EU4 with country ranks. An emperor is the monarchic ruler of an empire. But not all empires are monarchies, and not even all monarchic empires have emperors. Now, fundamentally, you'd assume that an empire has an emperor, that these two terms are linked in some way. I'm not going to digress into defining an empire in order to define an emperor, but suffice to say, Voltaire and his consequences. There is room for disagreement on the nature of an empire and the disconnect between the title and the practice of imperialism, notions of nationhood, and so on. But what about the emperor? In the Middle Kingdom context, the shortest version is, again, obvious. The Emperor of China, the Huangdi, also called the Tianzi, Son of Heaven, is the center of the Middle Kingdom, the paternal head of a Confucian ordering of the world. Simplified, the emperor is an emperor. But the nuance is important. With full awareness of analogy and anachronism, I want to start with describing what the term emperor means in Western contexts and how we've lost meaning there, because I think that'll help inform what other meanings we might lose in translation. Voltaire's bugbear, the Holy Roman Empire, is a good place to look. Due to a concept called translatio imperii, the Holy Roman Empire was understood to be the conceptual successor of Rome's authority and place as a center of Christendom. Did it actually emulate Rome? Not in practice, and other Christian sovereignties did not all unanimously defer to the emperor's grandeur or some such thing. But the concept of being the emperor, of there being only one, was, if inconsistently, respected within the Catholic world. In looking through uses of the title emperor outside the HRE, you'll find its use concentrated to the very early Middle Ages, where king and emperor are interchangeable in some Catholic realms. For a sizable period between then and the 1600s onwards, that respect largely holds. It's not until the Reformation and the religious wars that the respect falters. Europa Universalis V models this zero-sum emperorship among Catholic states. Colonial empires of Europe, participants in imperialism, in empire, did not consistently have emperors. Spain of the colonial era only had an emperor by way of the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperorship. The British Empire was unambiguously a thing and never overlapped with Catholicism, mind you, but it still never took the title of emperor for its sovereign outside of India. The latter point is less to say that the British Empire respected Holy Roman titles and more that there's some kind of weight to the title. It's more complicated than empire equals emperor. For much of the early modern period onward, for much of the time frame of the Europa Universalis games, emperors were rare. In telling the anecdote of Napoleon crowning himself emperor, the himself part is rightly stressed, but in doing so, I think we forget that being crowned emperor was not a remotely common thing. All that digression to clarify the power in a name, and with that in mind, we turn our eyes back eastward to Japan? You see, Japan has an emperor to this day, actually, and it has had one since at least 1500 to 2600 years ago. Though it's extremely important to clarify that the title has, for much of that time, been disempowered and of largely ceremonial and religious importance. China's emperorship was an accepted reality. Being part of the tribute system, the Sinocentric world, meant acknowledging that reality. Similar to the occasional uses of emperor titles by other nations, Vietnam and Korea both historically have proclaimed emperors, though, again, the majority of history is without one. Japan, as established moments ago, had an emperor the whole time, but the Middle Kingdom did not mutually recognize this emperorship. There could be only one Son of Heaven at the heart of one Middle Kingdom. Japan's position in all this can feel contradictory. How Confucian is Japan? How much does Japan acknowledge the Middle Kingdom in Sinocentrism? They maintained having an emperor even in times of tributary status, an emperor sometimes styled as the Son of Heaven, emulating China's Tianzi title for the emperor. As much as the answers to these questions changed across time, they are worth keeping in mind. I think in understanding other models of statehood and the relation of other nations to the Middle Kingdom, we get a grasp on how these things intersect and flesh each other out. In understanding what the Middle Kingdom was not, and what models existed parallel to it, we understand what makes the Middle Kingdom and its emperor distinct. Our ultimate goal is understanding the tribute system most of all, but it is only part of the broader structure. It is a structure with parts which intersect in ways that are hard to neatly divide. We will end up understanding a whole in order to understand a part. To bridge us into talking about foreign relations, I'll bring up the work of a Japanese Confucian scholar, Aizawa Seishisai, who I really ought to just give a dedicated video to. His lifetime is largely outside the scope of our core subject, being towards the end of the shogunate, but it contains some of these questions and offers some occasionally unclear answers. It could even be argued that his mixed Confucian and Japanese perspective fueled his proposal to empower the emperor, emulating China's emperorship even more, and in doing so, ultimately going against the innate Confucian hierarchy. He also developed a concept of Japanese nationalism, kokutai, that resulted directly from contact with Western ideas. And on the matter of foreign relations, he rejected the Sinocentric model while also refusing to lead towards a Western superiority. He is, in some sense, a culmination of the consequences of the Confucian Sinocentric model meeting the Western Westphalian model. And in departing from his work, we finally look at today's academic focus, David Kang's East Asia Before the West. David C. Kang is not a historian, and by his own words, his work is not history. He is a professor of international relations. So why choose this book? East Asia Before the West starts with a preface contending it is not a work of history, but of political science, drawing a distinction from the fact it was not drawn from primary source research in dusty archives. I don't find that to be a meaningful way to divide historical work from other social sciences. History is not solely about the absolute closest source, nor is a primary source universally better in all cases. In fact, in his occasional address of countervailing claims, he has done a touch of historiography. Much like a just a game claim doesn't shirk historical responsibility for a game, an it's not archival work doesn't make a book not an act in doing history. The stated goal of the book is to answer one question. How did international relations function in East Asia from the 14th to the 19th centuries? Said question arose for Kang out of frustration with European models being cast onto East Asia. There are, of course, other goals that are found and met along the way to that. One such goal is to describe the tribute system, in contrast to other models. Kang's view is that the tribute system was a real and significant element of historical Chinese statecraft and foreign policy. The inspiration for this thesis revolves loosely around the question of how, for nearly 5 centuries, the Sinic states in specific managed to avoid wars with each other, barring the Imjin War and China's invasion of Vietnam. In turn, the goal broadens back out to articulating why Western models of analysis and interstate relations do not fit historical China, and what we might look towards instead. Between its motivation and its position as not quite history, I think it is suited rather well to compare and map onto something like Europa Universalis with its inevitable European focus and loose responsibility to history. That all said, the description of not quite history does not mean the work is poorly done. It is an interesting and concise dive into the concept of the tribute system. And of course, the book is not without critiques, and we'll be looking at those as well. Now let's get into the approach to the tribute system. Kang makes several assertions relevant to our purposes, interlinked as they are. Each one is the center of a given chapter. In short, they are about the concept of hegemony as an ordering of international relations, the social and cultural force of Confucianism and Sinicization, the tangible role of the tribute system's connection to war, and the system's connection to trade. Though interesting, the section on frontiers is harder to apply for our purposes. The war and trade chapters will also be light in reference. They are worth reading for their own evidence and explorations of the topics, but in the abstract, their point is well made by the time they arrive. A formal organizing of states interwoven with the tribute system contributed to lasting peace and trade throughout the region. There are roughly 3 models Kang seeks to refute. One is that the tribute system was entirely symbolic, nearing non-existence, which is why I said Kang argues it is real. Another is an extractive model of tribute, whereby tributaries pay tribute to an overlord of some kind. This is not often the case with Chinese tributaries, though not entirely off the table as an occasional dynamic. The third popular model of the tribute system is a guise for trade, a model attributed to John K. Fairbank as noted by Kang himself. In my own education, this was, at times, the model used, arguing that China's tributary missions functionally created protected routes of travel, and thus were followed by traders. A divide forms in the opinion on if this trade was intended and just not remarked upon, or if it was incidental. That divide, in turn, sprawls onto the tribute system. The issue Kang raises about the incidental framing is the implied unawareness of the Confucian bureaucrats, that there's an assumption that the ministers of the empire were too removed, oblivious, or out of touch to understand their own tribute system. This is a recurring perspective Kang seeks to dispel. Per the quote, these arguments posit literal centuries of self-delusion on the part of Chinese officials. Rather than understand the tribute system as some manner of performative trade gesture or as a humbling veneer of respect slapped on top of resource extraction, Kang explores the possibility of a voluntary system. It's not that those nations which Sinicized did so in order to stave off invasion, but that there really was a cultural respect for China. Analogy, again, is risky, but I'm using it here to compare the nature of historians more than compare moments in history. Imagine if we never assumed that sovereignties contemporary to Rome styled themselves as the Roman did by their own volition. To stave off invasion indeed might be a reflexive approach, ostensibly comparing the westernizations of the 19th century and their motivations to Sinicizations before them. Though that assumes westernization was done in order to avoid being colonized, and it's a little more complicated than that. Ultimately, this leads us to a hierarchy model of relations between states, which the tribute system was part of, making it both symbolic and impactful. The hierarchy Kang proposes contrasts the Westphalian alternative that arrived later. It is a relation system of unequal states that do not seek to topple one another, something foreign to common analysis. This is a good angle to get into the first of his assertions on the nature of hierarchy. For Kang, the Sinocentric order is ostensibly a social one. Access to that social order and the legitimacy and recognition said access confers is granted through the tribute system. The tribute system is a mechanism of legitimation and recognition. In a broader context, he asks questions on the nature of status, where things that contribute to status rank among the priorities of states. He asks us to interrogate when material concerns overlap with, or more so, are at odds with status concerns and what a given state prioritizes. This is to set up the ephemeral concepts of deference, hegemony, and hierarchy. Indeed, the status of a country relative to another cannot only be measured by material ability, so it must be organized, in part, socially. He makes a distinction between recognition of a state and status of a state, with several examples, one of which being that the G8 is not comprised of the top 8 largest economies and thus not merely a material recognition, but one that also accounts for some manner of status. From here we can move to hierarchy and hegemony. Hegemony can only exist in a system that allows for hierarchy. In order for there to be what Kang defines as consensus on the right of one state to lead, there must be some idea of greaters and lessers, even if, in theory, all recognized states are equally sovereign, as in a Westphalian model. Recognition of the hegemony of the Middle Kingdom functionally permitted states into association with other states that recognized the hegemony. The tribute system was a display of this recognition. Important to Kang's definition of hegemony is the consensus element. Primacy is the outcome of material conditions and, in turn, forced will, the threat of violence or material harm. Hegemony is not enforced through said threats, even implicitly. It is an amicable agreement, an acknowledgement without shame. Hierarchy, of course, is a significant element of Confucianism, which offers a paternalistic structure for society, and in turn, societies of states. Less of a religion than a philosophy of ordering, Confucianism's place in the Sinocentric order is indistinguishable from Sinicization. Confucian practices and culturally open Chinese practices overlap significantly. Kang begins with the note that Confucianism lacks for an evangelizing angle and instead was something selectively adopted by states in the region for varying reasons to varying degrees. Kang continues by exploring the idea of an enduring notion of China and Confucianism's role in it. Admitting to anachronism in using the term, Kang describes a dichotomy between civilization and barbarians, made along lines of respect for Sinic culture and Confucian rules. His point in connection to the tribute system is again one of setting the stage of, to use another anachronistic term, soft power. Ultimately, the cultural adoption of Chinese and Confucian practices becomes another example for China's centering, voluntarily participated in but nigh gravitational. Even Japan, as peripheral as it often seemed, and indeed during the Tokugawa Sakoku era, ordered itself along Confucian lines and relied on cultural and legal import from China. China was the model on which sovereign statehood in the region was based. And none of this is to say that Chinese culture was entirely displacing the local cultures of places like Vietnam and Korea, which were more Sinicized. From here, we finally move toward the tribute system directly and tie up how hierarchy, Sinicization, and Confucianism not only led to each other, but were recursively reinforced and expressed by the tribute system. We also indirectly return to Kang's inciting incident of curiosity, the relative peace of East Asia, and the role of shared culture and norms in that peace, as represented by the tribute system. To become a tributary was to be recognized explicitly, and it was to accept Sinicization implicitly. In being a tributary, certain customs had to be respected, such as use of the Chinese calendar in correspondence with the emperor. In those instances, it was not a demand for mass adoption of a Chinese practice so much as an acknowledgement of China at the center. The tribute system was not just a back and forth between the Middle Kingdom and its tributaries, but a network by which tributary states, through that relation with the Middle Kingdom, addressed, interacted with, and learned about each other. Further still, emulations of the tribute system were cast unto diplomatic missions between states, as in the case of the post-Imjin Korea and Japanese normalizations. The tribute system was not only important as a nexus of actual activity, but as a model of statehood and interstate relations. Hopefully all of that is sufficient for addressing Kang's argument as we move on to critiques. Now, as I've done before, instead of trying to introduce other entire books to explore the way a subfield approaches the topic as a whole, we're going to look at reviews. Morris Rossabi of the City University of New York is quite right, and not alone, in pointing out that Kang's thesis of a particular 5 centuries of East Asian peace laid largely upon the tribute system's working was not in fact universally applied, nor exclusively absent where the tribute system was not established. The states to China's north and west throughout the period, ranging from Mongolia to Tibet, though not as Sinicized as say Vietnam or Korea, certainly did pay tribute, and they certainly did get invaded by China at some stage. Kang does address the war with frontier states, but the disagreement is about if they count against Kang's premise. Rossabi questions if there are under-evaluated material conditions at play, and, in turn, if there's actually a unique international relations system here, or if war was simply not in the interest of the regional actors. Is China unique as a model, or are material conditions too different for it to matter? I'll note here that the concluding sentiment of Kang has offered a provocative thesis which will stimulate much analysis and discussion, well, certainly not backhanded, feels to me like the polite way to say, he's wrong, but it's interesting to consider. For a largely positive review, Hang Lin of the Universität Würzburg considers the tribute chapter to be among the best, while also praising the presentation of a non, or at least pre-Western model of relations. James Rice, a then East Asian Studies professor at Bucknell University, agrees with what I said about the not a work of history thing. He goes on to highlight the framing that Kang has argued, in his view, successfully against, that pre-modern China had a master-vassal relation with its neighbors. He similarly praises Kang's effort to correct the Western view of these relations, even if it is done with some stumbles. Nicholas Anderson of Georgetown University's review calls into question some of the spaced-out, seemingly contradictory accounts, whereby in one section Kang may briefly speak against his own point and imply that, for example, Vietnam submitted out of fear, not respect, or the tribute system was a veneer. More critically, in my view, is the note that many of you may have been thinking this whole time, that the peace between Sinic states might have a lot more to do with the volatility of internal affairs. Anderson brings up Vietnam and Japan, essentially asking, what if they were too preoccupied fighting themselves to fight each other? After all, it's no small note that this period overlaps with the Sengoku Jidai and several small succession crises in Vietnam. I recommend a look at all the featured reviews on JSTOR. Now we can move forward to tying everything we have back to the games I swear this video is in some way about. In order to discuss the tribute system and its potential for unique play, we must understand the baseline of relations between states in the Europa Universalis games. EU4 and EU5 portray recognized states as sovereign and equal, while the AI clearly measures relative power. There is a de facto hierarchy to the power of states, by which diplomatic calculations are accepted or rejected. The AI respects that each tag is sovereign because the game requires that, but it measures its dealings with a tag by things like military score, diplomatic reputation, and country rank. There is, of course, the question of which tags have transgressible borders, and what that says about relative sovereignty in EU4, and EU5's as of now or at least under-implemented idea of power projection and the ability to transgress those of lesser power. Whether or not that exact model of relations returns to EU5, there are still clear differences in recognition between a state with map presence and a people. Europa Universalis, and indeed most Paradox titles, opt for a modified Westphalian model of relations whereby tags, that is, entities of the game which may not all be defined as countries, are interacted with on roughly equal planes. The Hansa is as much a tag as Sweden and may, for example, declare war. We have some thoughts to keep in mind from all this, though they aren't questions I intend to answer here. In a game clearly designed around Western history first and foremost, with the West presumed default, are its systems built to be truly neutral? Can the game handle more than one simultaneous model of foreign relations? Does it presume a generalization that is not neutral? To bring us back to the topic of East Asia, is a given Paradox game built with the systems necessary to express some iteration of the Sinocentric order? And in turn, we come back to that question asked by one reviewer of Kang's work, of if said order, said history, is actually all that unique. Now with that said, let's talk about the tribute system in EU4 and 5. The tribute system is, true to form, a model of a dynasty's relation to the periphery of its empire. Said relation is one of paying tribute, being a tributary to the Middle Kingdom. But tributary status exists outside of the Middle Kingdom dynamic in these games. Normally the idea is that one country pays another country some share of its income or resources and is, in turn, protected or at least not attacked. Tributary status is extractive, though less integrated than a vassal. This is not an effective model for the Chinese tribute system, so we have to ask what they've changed to make it work in a more bespoke fashion. In EU4, the tributaries are directly relevant to your ability to hold the mandate of heaven. In fact, having non-tributary states bordering you can be an active detriment. This is a nod to that concept of being uncontested as the middle, the center of the world. And then comes back that distinction of tributary in the default sense versus tributary in a Middle Kingdom sense. How does Europa Universalis represent the tribute system relative to the arguments of Kang, to the people he argues against? How real is the tribute system? In what direction? Should it be a system of monetary extraction for gameplay purposes? If it isn't, does it still serve player interest to expand it? And indeed, ought it be the same system across centuries? It would be a colossal ask to have it shift across time, but it's unrealistic to assume the system was static across centuries and through the change of entire dynasties. I would say that depicting said change is past the line of reasonable duty to history for the game. A fun thing to imagine that is way too big a burden for a game like this is some kind of alterable game rule which redefines the model of the tribute system for a run, along the lines of Fairbank or Kang or other existing models. I wouldn't dare ask this of a developer, but imagine if these games could be subtly adjusted in such ways. The concepts of synicizing, culture, tribute, and hegemony are heavily interlinked in Kang's work. In EU5, there's a similar connection. Synicization is a value in-game, and it represents both actual synicization and Confucian influence, largely inseparable as they are. As for the system's relation to war and peace, well, let's make a comparison. In the general zero-sum anarchic structure of Europa Universalis, there is very little reason for a player of a unified Spain to not absorb a diplomatically isolated Portugal. Depending on the patch, this may also be the AI's thinking as well. Much the same unto Korea for the dominant Chinese power. I bring up Portugal to ground a Western example where part of the answer is clearly recognition between nations. States, in reality, do not expand at every given opportunity, or, at the least, define an opportunity for expansion as more than just sheer military capability. So, why didn't, say, the Ming just take over Korea? Kang posits that the overlapping crises around the time of the Imjin War show it wasn't a matter of military capacity. The hierarchic understanding of international relations present in the Sinocentric model leaves less room for, proverbially, map painting. Sovereignty ultimately was still respected in a hegemonic model, as much as that might seem counterintuitive. In this light, I think the tribute system, which protects tributaries from only outside forces, might need some reconsideration. Now, of course, this might cross the pale into anti-fun, but one of the larger points of Kang's work is that instability in the region was tethered to China's own instability, and an unstable yuan is nigh inevitable. Perhaps modeling a modified version of the HRE's unique imperial peace enforcement, or even making enforced peace a passive consequence of celestial authority, would work. But again, that could be seen as anti-fun. China's instability could also cause cascading failures of international order. After all, it wasn't the arrival of the West that changed social order forever, it was centuries later, during the collapse of the Qing, that Japan shifted the balance, colonized Korea, and eventually made war on China itself. Introduction to the existence of another model of foreign relations did not shatter the old one. The old one shattered, and the alternative remaining one became the norm. EU5's representation of the tribute system has room to be remarkably strong and is starting off in a good place. Questions remain about how anti-fun or anti-meta it should be for the sake of play. If it did what it historically did and gave a given China cultural and prestige-based bonuses far more than monetary ones, then it would only be worth maintaining as a player so long as culture and prestige are, themselves, valuable to play. Should we bend historical portrayals to the meta, to the average player? Is it even fair to assume that historically accurate event choices and systems and obligations ought to be, mechanically speaking, the right choice? To step back and into another example, Poland historically chose a union with Lithuania, and that's also the player choice compared to the local noble 9 times out of 10, even accounting for alternative metas. But that was EU4. In EU5, it would have to model the states as equal, not senior and lesser. In a CK3 framing, the electoral nature of Poland's monarchy would be a dangerous mechanic to work around rather than a way to functionally accrue more personal union targets. You can see how historical events are being interpreted as good for gameplay. For a less familiar but more directly related example, Yuan gets an event about the employment of the artist Wu Shen, and the historical choice is, ostensibly, the worse one. The consequences of said historical choice are, mechanically, working backwards from a conclusion and implying that employing a Chinese artist was one of the dominoes within the fall of the yuan. Is 10 prestige worth all the negative but historical effects? Would most players gravitate to the historical 10 prestige with negative effects? This example gets even more complicated when we consider why one might want the yuan to collapse while playing them. All that to say that different mechanical portrayals of a historical event or system can make them either good or bad for the player. Sometimes it's obvious when something could be a boon versus a malice, but sometimes it's down to unclear trade-offs and thus developer discretion. Other times it's down to what a player might not want. Right now in EU5, deleting starting forts is a smart idea for some countries as the forts seem superfluous. Right now in EU5, some players will find the tribute system taxing their potential more than enhancing it. Ultimately, Kang's work is a template for a potential depiction of the tribute system. On its own, it explores and expands beyond assumptions about China and its relation to other states in a period that heavily overlaps with the time frame of Europa Universalis 5. In understanding the tribute system and its connected concepts, we understand the Middle Kingdom and what makes it unique. We understand why it has to be designed around. And on the topic of design, we're left with questions that go beyond just the tribute system, of if flavor should inherently be fun or beneficial. EU5's position as a more simulationist game has... I'm going to stop right there and save that for the future. We'll get there when we get there. Hi. Turns out there are some fun and exciting hiccups to editing a new video on a laptop with the wrong resolution. I don't know what genius decided they should all be a 16:10 aspect ratio now, but oh well, it's what I've got, I guess. But I shouldn't complain. It's made running games and my editor software a lot smoother. Thanks to everyone who watched to this point and to the regime loyalists over at Patreon. In particular, this time we have Alessandro Andrioni, Chen Ursa, Cesare Mikua, Clever Riley 9, Dan C, Galactic Beyond, Gilded Dragon, Hornlet, Isaac of Lyria, Jay Kasky, Laird Olive, Lacing Afame, Mark Soto, Mehrab, Michael Kelly, Nick, Nita Peer, Non-Szechuan, Riley Long, Sipoternipsy, Third Xeno, Viture, and Yura Silkorsky. Do let me know if I've missed anyone. I tried to keep things organized during the big switchover of a new laptop and some other life things, but sometimes things fall through. I promise it's not intentional. Also, thank you to Hungry Minds for sponsoring this video, as well as giving me a copy of the book. Do be sure to check out the link in the description, and if anything catches your eye, use the code Rosenkreutz at checkout for 10% off. I don't know what the next video is going to be about, not even a guess. It won't be EU5 at least. I need the game to be more stable before I try having history opinions on it. I guess there's a lot of follow-up videos I've got some right to make. We'll see. Bye.